We were interested in studying a significant seasonal cycle in financial markets that hadn't been given serious consideration before. Essentially, we observed that in September and October, there seemed to be a real cluster of financial market crashes. So thinking back to the crash of 1929, Black Tuesday, or the crash of 1987, Black Monday, and even the most recent financial crisis of 2008-2009, they got started in the fall months. And we thought maybe this isn't a simple coincidence. In fact, going back even further in time, before the existence of the Federal Reserve System in the US, there were bank runs much more concentrated in the fall months. So we started wondering whether maybe there's some feature of human behavior, human nature, that might help us understand this phenomenon. We noticed in the literatures of medicine, psychology, and psychiatry that there was increasing awareness of a condition called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. So this condition has up to 10% of the population, depending on location, suffering from clinical depression during the fall and winter months. And you know, the condition can be quite severe. Depression obviously is very serious. And along with depression can come significant changes in willingness to tolerate risk. So people become depressed in the fall and winter months primarily because of reduced exposure to daylight. And since there was this connection between depression, daylight, and risk-taking, we wondered if that might help explain what goes on in financial markets with, of course, people all around the world experiencing this depression on a seasonal basis. We thought it might help us shed some light on what's going on. So we started by looking at stock markets, and what we found is a very strong statistical correlation between the timing of depression symptoms among people who suffer from SAD and what was actually happening in the markets. So what looked to be happening in stock markets is around the fall, people became more risk averse, and this made them less interested in holding risky stocks. And so there would be selling pressure, and this would lead to some years an actual significant drop in markets. And investors who were maybe more risk tolerant and who would stay in the stock market would actually earn a higher rate of return on their investments if they held through all the way to the spring when everybody else's willingness to hold risk rebounded. So this was kind of interesting, and we found that in markets at more extreme latitudes, where the seasons have a more profound effect on the moods due to the even more diminished daylight, countries like Sweden, they have a much stronger seasonal pattern in their stock returns than countries like the US or Canada. And even more interesting, in the Southern Hemisphere, looking at countries like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, where the seasons are 6 months out of sync relative to the North, the effects in markets were also 6 months out of sync. And this by itself was fascinating. Of course, you always wonder, you know, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. So we broadened our study to look at other facets of markets. So rather than just focus on the risky extreme, we thought we would look at the safest extreme as well. So instead of stocks, we considered government bonds. The US government issues what are considered to be the safest asset in existence. And what we found in the safe securities is basically the opposite of what we found in the risky side. So during the seasons when investors seemed to shun risky stock, they were flocking towards these safe alternatives. And in another study, actually, we looked at mutual fund holdings and investors' willingness to put funds into risky versus safe mutual funds. And there again, we saw this striking pattern. In the fall months, people are basically pulling money out of the risky mutual funds to put it into the safer. And then in the spring, those flows reverse directions. And one final thing, we did some experiments actually working with actual humans, hundreds of them. And we had them make choices between risky and safe financial assets effectively. And their participation for taking part in the experiments would depend on their choices. So if they chose risky securities in our study, then their payoff in the experiment would also be risky, as opposed to choosing something safe, they'd get a fixed payoff. And indeed, they were much more reluctant to choose the risky payoff in the fall and winter months than they were in the spring and summer. Well, I think there are a couple of interesting takeaways. So first of all, emotions affect decisions. And even financial decisions. And so this is fascinating. You know, even in a market like the US Treasury security market, which is dominated by professional, very, very wealthy investors, we see this big seasonal pattern that seems to be driven by human sentiment. This is fascinating. So it suggests maybe times when we're feeling very emotional might be a bad time to be making important economic decisions, financial decisions. You know, we like to promote a buy and hold approach anyways. Maybe if it's autumn and markets are going crazy, that's not the best time to just sell everything. A second takeaway, I think, applies more to policymakers, regulators, organizations like the Federal Reserve System. The timing of economic news can really matter. So maybe the same information, bad economic news coming out in the fall, could affect markets very differently compared to that same information coming out in the spring. So when these policymakers are trying to decide how to respond, they might consider taking more interventive kind of measures during the fall season than they might be willing to do in the spring.